In this video, we'll discover other what we had identified as pourquoi stories, or mythological explanations for why things in the world are the way they are. We had already identified in the previous video the explanations in mythological terms for why snakes shed their skin, as well as why people die. There's at least one other small mythological explanation, which involves a bird in the Epic of Gilgamesh called the Little Shepherd Bird. This bird seems remarkably similar to a bird in this hemisphere called the kildee or killdeer. In the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh says to the fertility goddess Ishtar, "You loved the colorful little shepherd bird," and then hit him, breaking his wing. So now he stands in the forest crying, "My wing, my wing." The killdeer is a golden, white, and black bird that has a unique defense mechanism because it lays its eggs in a nest on the ground. When a predator, like a fox, a cat, a dog, or a human, comes too close to the killdeer's nest, the killdeer will fly up into the air and then flop around as if one of its wings is broken and it's injured, while emitting this cry that sounds pained. This behavior will distract the predator away from the ground nest and towards what it thinks is an easy meal of an injured bird. Once the predator is thoroughly distracted, the killdeer will fly away to safety, and the eggs in the nest have been protected. This is what we would call, in terms of evolutionary biology, a defense mechanism. For the Epic of Gilgamesh, the reason why this very similar sounding bird exhibits these very similar sounding behaviors is because the gods did it. These sorts of stories are very common throughout the world's cultures, throughout history. One example would be the story of Coyote in the mythology of the Nez Perce. If you go to the link that you see in the PowerPoint slide, you'll read the story of a great monster going around and eating up all of the animals. And the animals cry out to Coyote, "Coyote, save us from the belly of the monster." Coyote, having nothing better to do, agrees, "Sure, I'll save you guys." And Coyote jumps down the throat of the monster. And once he's in the belly, he says to all the other animals, "Follow me, I will lead you the way out." And so Coyote starts right back up the esophagus, and behind him is Bear. And as Coyote is going up the esophagus, his back foot slips, and he kicks Bear right in the face. And this is the reason why, for all time, Bear has a short, stubby nose. Because Coyote kicked him in the face in the beginning of time. After all the animals are out, there's only one animal who's left, and that's the naked mole rat. The story goes that Mole Rat was the last one to escape the monster, and the only opening that he could escape through was the anus, which was closing tighter and tighter, And Mole Rat had to squeeze and shimmy out the closing opening, and as he did so, it pulled all of the hair off of him. And that's the reason why, for all time, Mole Rat is naked, because he was the last one out of monster. It would have made sense to this Native American culture that there must be some explanation for why a naked mole rat is such a weird-looking animal. So they created a story involving supernatural beings at the beginning of time to explain why something in the world is the way it is. That's in the exact same way that the ancient Greeks explained how it rained by saying, Zeus reigns. And Aristotle was able to replace that supernatural explanation with a natural one. In the same way, an evolutionary biologist would explain the reason why naked mole rat is naked is because it serves an evolutionary benefit. That, too, is a natural explanation rather than a supernatural one. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice is a Greek myth involving traveling to the underworld to rescue a loved one who had been bitten by a serpent. The story of Orion and the Scorpion is about the constellations Orion and Scorpio that are never in the sky at the same time, so that they do not battle eternally. The ancient Greeks told a mythological story that at the beginning of time, the constellations Orion and Scorpio battled continuously across the night sky. And so that these two warring star creatures would not tear the sky apart, the gods split them up, so that in one half of the year Orion is seen in the night sky, and in the other half of the year the constellation Scorpio is seen in the night sky. That is a supernatural or mythological explanation for a natural phenomenon. Do you know how we explain that phenomenon now? The answer is the revolution of the Earth around the Sun, when the night sky of the Earth is pointed towards one part of the galaxy, we see one set of constellations. And 6 months later, when the night sky is pointed towards an opposite part of the galaxy, we see a different set of constellations. That's referred to as heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. A controversial idea in the history of philosophy, religion, and science, as we'll later see. But uncontroversial in terms of observational evidence today. Thus, the explanation, the gods did it, has been replaced with an explanation of this is a natural phenomenon. In the same way that no gods are needed to explain what Aristotle understands as the water cycle. The Greek myth of the Pleiades 7 sisters that are pursued by an attacker until the gods take pity on them and carry them up into the sky, where they become 7 sister stars, has this same form. Why is something in the world the way it is? The gods did it. And you'll notice that this explanation survives with us to this day. All of these are merely attempts to explain why. What we get to wrestle with is how to make sense of conflicting religious as opposed to scientific epistemologies, which attempt to answer the question, why? Which is the single most important philosophical, also scientific, and religious question. The Roman poet Ovid's story of the Metamorphoses explains the origins of laurel trees, of magpies and spiders. And the Greek myth of Persephone, in which the daughter of the goddess of grain, Demeter, is abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld, then tricked with pomegranate seeds, forcing her to remain in Hades half of the year, which is winter, and to return to her mother, heralded by flowers each year in spring. This is a story that explains why the seasons change. The answer is, the gods do it. Do you know how we today, according to contemporary Western science, explain why the seasons change? The answer would be axial tilt. As the Earth tilts on its axis. When the northern hemisphere is closer to the sun and thus receives more direct sunlight, it's summer in the northern hemisphere and winter in the southern hemisphere. 6 months later, when the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun and receives less direct sunlight, it's winter in the northern hemisphere and summer in the southern hemisphere. For the Greeks, this was explained by the activities of the gods. Much like Aristotle's explanation for why it rains, modern science has replaced supernatural explanations with natural ones in attempting to answer why the world is the way it is. Notice that the blood-red pomegranate seeds might serve a literary or symbolic purpose. I neglected to mention when we were discussing the Epic of Gilgamesh that the boxthorn plant, which grants immortality, draws blood, which means that if a person is to gain eternal life, there is a blood debt that must be paid. That theme or motif you will likely recognize has striking similarities with Christian metaphysical belief systems and its symbolism. As we move from Middle Eastern and Mediterranean indigenous belief systems, first Babylonian and then Greek, Native American, we can also include Shintoism, the indigenous belief and metaphysical system of Japan. Shintoism has ancestor worship, which we've discussed previously. Also, kami, which are nature spirits, and are seen etymologically in the word kamikaze. We'll return to the concept of suicide bombing momentarily. But first, we can also identify a syncretism, which means a blending of religions and cultures, with Buddhism and Confucianism. This is especially exemplified by the divine status of the Japanese emperor, ending after Japan's defeat in World War II. Japan's emperor was considered to be a god king prior to the end of World War II. This means that religion and politics were perfectly mixed. It's easy enough to get a person to risk their life, fight, and even to die for their nation. Combine that with for their religion and their God, and it's even easier still. Lastly, include in that the idea that the soul does not end at death, but goes on. In terms of Shintoism, through reincarnation. But for the Crusader during the period of the Crusades, or for the suicide bomber in the Middle East today, the concept of an immortal paradise in heaven is equally capable of permitting people to throw away this life with the belief that it's not really the end. Imagine if instead of Japan losing World War II, roles had been reversed. At the end of World War II, one of the conditions for surrender for Japan was that it was forced to separate religion and politics. Imagine if instead the United States of America were really and truly forced to separate religion and politics. Would anything be different? If so, then that might indicate the degree to which religion and politics are currently interspersed or intertwined, overlapping. If nothing would change, then perhaps we really do have a true separation of church and state. I suggest, if you want to get a visualization of what these nature spirits might look like, the movie Princess Mononoke by Hayao Miyazaki, which won an Academy Award, is excellent. As we turn to the indigenous religion of North Africa, we find another form of ancient polytheism, with many gods, god kings, and especially important for our purposes, not only the concept of the immortal soul, but a god king who dies and is resurrected. In this case, explaining agricultural fertility and why crops grow in the spring. The myth of Osiris, which bears similarities to the story of Jesus, serves a similar purpose to the Greek myth of Persephone, which we had just discussed. It explains why crops grow in the spring in the northern hemisphere. The death and resurrection of Osiris, god king of the Egyptians, represents the triumph of life over death. In a similar way that the Christian holiday Easter is celebrated in spring in the northern hemisphere, similarly symbolizing the triumph of life over death. Much like indigenous Hawaiian religion, the indigenous Egyptian religion includes a god of the earth named Geb, who is considered to be the very first pharaoh. It's worth noting, then, that the very first ruler of Egypt is the earth itself, the land itself, and that they live upon the body of their god. That there's not a hard and fast division between the divine and the merely natural. It's also worth paying special attention to the bull god Apis, who carries a sun disk between its horns. Notice in this image on the left, a man is bowing down in worship to this sacred cow. On the right is a funeral mummification mask made out of gold for such a cow. It likely would have made sense for the ancient Egyptians to worship their oxen and cows. The reason why is that these people likely depended upon these animals for their very livelihoods. Bulls and cows are useful for milk, for meat, for leather and tools, and as a primitive form of a tractor to plow fields. Likely their civilization could not have existed without domesticated cows. Therefore, because their lives depended upon these animals, literally, they revered them as holy. You might hear people say in our society today, I could not live without God, or I could not live without my dependence upon religion. For these people, that dependence is literal and physical. They cannot live in the way that they live as a civilization without these animals. So, the animals are sacred and worshipped for that reason. Notice in this image you see Osiris, mummified and green. He's literally a zombie, back from the dead. Notice also that you see Osiris, the divine feminine goddess associated with magic and fertility, has a throne or a chair on the top of her head. While we might identify a sort of sexism in this representation, instead, it might symbolize that without the support of the divine feminine, the pharaoh cannot rule, so that the feminine holds up the civilization and the society. Osiris teaches the people of Egypt agriculture, religion, and law. He's cut into 14 pieces by his brother Set or Seth. His wife, Isis, recovers these pieces except for his phallus, which is the penis, which she magically recreates. This is a common symbol of fertility known around the world in various forms. She resurrects Osiris long enough to give birth to a son, Horus. Living pharaohs are referred to as Horus. Osiris becomes king and judge of the dead, and the most recently deceased pharaoh becomes Osiris in the afterlife. And Osiris's death and resurrection plays out each day as the sun, Ra, rises and sets, and each year as the plants regrow in the spring, as if coming back to life from the dead after the cold, lifeless winter. Similar to the Greek story of Persephone. Notice that one of the well-known features of religious belief in a society is that it is often an effective means of social control. Imagine if the current president became the judge of the dead in the afterlife. This might give you considerably more reason to be very respectful and deferential to the president in life, because he controls your fate in the afterlife. That is likely a remarkably efficient mechanism for ensuring social order, which is, among other things, something that religions are noted for being good at. In our next video, we'll deal with one last Babylonian philosophical as well as political system, specifically the Code of Hammurabi, and use that as a foil to think through the ethics and politics of the death penalty.